Before we leave storage groups, I want to talk about some database issues that you may or may not be aware of. First of all, when we set up a storage group, we start adding stores to it. We'll talk about that more in the next video. But I want you to notice that if I right-click the storage group and go to Properties, we were here a little earlier, but notice there's a transaction log location. We can determine where the transaction log will be stored. And I'm going to talk about what a transaction log is in just a second. But what I want you to notice is each individual storage group has its own transaction log. So if I have 3 stores in this storage group, notice in this storage group I have the first storage group and then I have a second storage group. And if I look at this, there's my second storage group. And so that second storage group has a transaction log location called Program Files Exchange Server Second Storage. And notice there's second storage. And so notice there's the EDBs and STMs and transaction logs. And here are your transaction logs. What exactly is a transaction log? If you're new to databases, or maybe that's just a refresher for you, Exchange is a database application. So we've got a database running on the disk, and so we need to input data to the database. Well, if we have a lot of people at once trying to input data to the database, we got 2 concerns. Number 1, speed, and number 2, integrity. And so what we can do, what databases do then, instead of going straight here, forget that, we have what's called a transaction log. Now, the transaction log serves a lot of purposes. We input data into the transaction log and it goes sequentially onto the transaction log. Then, periodically, automatically, the computer will take information from the transaction log, say the first 3 lines here of data, and move them into the database. It will do this based on availability of processes and so forth. But this does a really neat thing. Let's, for example, say that this is a 2 terabyte database. Okay? Now, by writing into this transaction log, we're writing all the changes that are being made to this database. We could back up this transaction log tonight. And so we have all of our changes from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock today. And instead of having to back up a 2 terabyte database, we simply back up maybe a 1 megabyte or 2 megabyte transaction log. Also, this lets the machine be a little bit more efficient about how it writes in. Here's the reason I brought up all that. If we're writing into this transaction log and the transaction log is writing into the database, it makes sense then to put the transaction log and the database on 2 separate physical disks. Does that make sense? So here's our database and here's our transaction log. So now what we're doing is we're writing to the transaction log and it's writing to the database. So we don't have disk contention. Now this can drastically increase efficiency on Exchange because it's making the database run much faster. Now this is basic database stuff. If you're a SQL and Oracle person, this stuff will make sense to you. There's one other thing that you need to be aware of out there in the Exchange System Manager. When I right click on the storage and I go to Properties, you will notice it's saying, can I enable circular logging? And here's what happens when you enable circular logging. The real answer is no, you don't want to do this, because this is great for a test environment or so forth. Because what Exchange does, and again, let's go back out here. Notice these logs. Every time this log file fills up, okay, it will simply create a new log file, dump the data into it, and we'll see an EO2 or something like that out here. We'll see multiple log files. And notice they're going to hit about 5 megabytes. Let me go back out to my sketch here. If I am writing into my database from the transaction log, then at the end of the day, I've got all these items still in the transaction log. Circular logging says that once you write this into the database, go in and erase it out of the transaction log and use that space over and over and over, which means this transaction log will never fill up. And it also means I can't back up or restore anything from this transaction log. Okay, so don't do that. Restoring and database backups are a whole other thing. We'll talk about them later. But that's what logging is. Generally, you want to do this in a test environment when you don't want to depend on transaction logs for backups. So now in the next video, we're going to talk about how to use data stores and storage groups all together. And this is some pretty cool stuff.